Well, welcome to the webinar. We are glad you're here. In case we haven't met, my name is Matt Freije. Thank you for joining us. This is the first public webinar we've offered in about 6 years. Since then, we've done only private training webinars for our LAMPS community. So it was really good to see names I've not seen in a long time on the registration list. More than 700 people registered. I think it's around 740, 750 last time I checked. Some of you are up very early to join us from Australia, others working late or up late from somewhere in Europe or in Japan. Most of you are with facilities of some type, many different types of facilities, but there are also many from health departments, water treatment people, consultants, and a variety of other professionals. Wherever you are or whatever you do, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Today, we are talking about ASHRAE 514. Which became an ANSI standard late July, I think it was July 25th. And by the way, if you were on the ASHRAE 514 committee, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to do that. I know that probably involved a lot of meetings and work you had to do between meetings, so thank you for devoting that time. But we'll talk about how 514 compares with ASHRAE standard 188, some of the challenges of complying with ASHRAE 514, and then how to go about addressing those challenges. At a glance, ASHRAE 514 looks a lot longer than 188 because there are 92 pages in total compared to 28, but 74 pages are appendices, which are not actually part of the standard. So the standard itself is only a page longer, 18 instead of 17 pages. And the appendices aren't part of the standard, as I mentioned. So we're not going to talk about that today. I would encourage you to read the appendices. They have some good information, but we're going to focus today on the standard. There are a lot of similarities between the two. They are both about managing water systems and buildings, and they both require a water management plan for certain types of water systems like whirlpools, spas, and decorative fountains, regardless of building risk factors. But then requirements for managing other systems, those systems have to be in the water management plan if the building has certain risk factors, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, those risk factors. The framework, the outline is essentially the same. The section numbers aren't exactly the same, but the flow is and the outline. And that's probably on purpose so that ASHRAE can combine, or at least has the option to easily combine the two standards at some point. You could fit them together like a puzzle piece. And the essential elements are basically the same too. Some of the wording might be different, but it boils down to forming a team that will establish a plan that includes a description of water systems in the building with flow diagrams, a risk analysis, you might call it a hazard analysis of the building water systems, which amounts to determining where there is a risk of the presence and spread of contaminants. And then also of those locations where control measures can effectively be applied. So that's called control locations. And then number 3, then you need to have control measures for those control locations. And each control measure has to have a performance limit and then a monitoring procedure to determine whether it's being done within those performance limits. Control limits, they're called. And then if it isn't, there needs to be corrective action, and the corrective action has to be outlined ahead of time. So that's part of the control measure as well. Verification that the program is being implemented, validation that the program is effective in controlling the hazards, documentation of all the activities, and then a plan for communication and notifications. So these risk factors are pretty much the same in both standards, but there are some differences. So you might know in ASHRAE 188, one of the risk factors was if the building had 10 or more stories, or I shouldn't use past tense. That is what's in the standard, if it has 10 or more stories. ASHRAE 514, it's greater than 6 stories. Not sure how they came up with that difference scientifically, but that's how it is. And both say it's a risk factor if the building is housing for occupants 65 years or older, or in ASHRAE 514, they add in or younger than 2 years. And then this slide doesn't have all the building risk factors. It's just pointing out some of the differences. So 4 of them that are in 514 that are not in 188, that's worth noting, is supplemental disinfection of potable water or domestic water. I'll use those terms interchangeably. For our purposes here, it means the same thing. So if there is a system that's adding, for example, chemicals for disinfecting the domestic water system at your point of entry or in the hot water, that would be a risk factor. And then if the building is over 50,000 square feet and has a booster pump for the domestic water system, if it has an area for surgeries, and not only healthcare, but if it's in ASHRAE 514, if there's long-term care, like skilled nursing, then that's a risk factor. So by the way, you can do with these what you want. In lamps, we emphasize consistency among water system types, regardless of some of these factors. There are some differences, but for example, we don't recognize the number of stories. If there are some measures that are in lamps, regardless of the number of stories of buildings, for example, if there are 2 feeds to a building and one of those feeds gets used only as a backup, we believe that situation needs to be managed because that backup feed can become really foul. It's not only important for reducing the risk of illness, but even for just protecting the components in your system from fouling. So regardless of the size of the building, whether it's 1 story or 100 stories, we think that's a good thing to do. That's a good practice. So we don't recognize all these, and you can have a management plan that applies to your facilities, probably should consistently, like if you have a chain of hotels, regardless of whether each one has one of these specific factors, over 50,000 square feet, over 7 stories or so forth. But anyway, so ASHRAE says in both of these standards, if the property has any one of these risk factors, then 188 says it needs to have a water management program for the potable water systems. ASHRAE 514 says it needs to have a program for all the building water systems and devices. The biggest difference between the two standards is in the scope or in the hazards that must be controlled. ASHRAE 188 is laser specific. It's to reduce the risk of legionellosis, or from a water management standpoint, that means to control Legionella. Now, ASHRAE 514 requires compliance with 188, so it includes Legionella as well, but all other microbial hazards too, as well as illness and injury from physical and chemical hazards. That's what it says in Section 1. And in Section 5.1, it gives an even more general statement. It says overall risk of illness or injury from hazards associated with building water systems. So that's just kind of a big bucket that anything related to building water systems that is hazardous needs to be controlled. So that is a huge difference in terms of the scope. And that is the biggest challenge too of ASHRAE 514 is this broad scope to reduce illness, injury from physical, chemical, and microbial hazards. Doesn't mean you should disregard ASHRAE 514 because that seems too challenging. Just deal with the challenge. And here's how I would recommend in this case that you do that. Go ahead and expand your water management program to include additional hazards, physical, chemical hazards, but just make sure that scope is limited, achievable, and clear. If you don't do that, if you use a scope that is verbatim from ASHRAE 514 to reduce illness and injury from physical, chemical, and microbial hazards, you set yourself up for failure. It's impossible, of course, to succeed at a task or at a job that's not well defined, that's ever expanding, like microbial hazards. I mean, some yet to even be discovered, right? So the list keeps growing, it keeps changing. Ones that have been found in domestic water systems, for example, and found to be associated with infections. So don't set yourself up for failure. Write a scope that is limited, achievable, and clear so you can know whether or not you're successful and really be successful with your plan. The risk analysis, hazard analysis needs to be synced up with that, the control measures and the validation procedures as well. So again, the hazard analysis is where you determine locations where those hazards present a significant risk. The control measures are the operation and maintenance procedures. You should have them also for design and construction and responding to specific incidents like water main breaks, but those procedures that reduce the hazards. And then the validation procedures are the ones that determine, the tests that determine whether or not the program is successful in controlling those hazards with the control measures you have, right? So it all relates to the hazards and it all needs to be synced up with the scope, and the control measures and hazard analysis and validation procedures need to be specific and clear, just like the scope needs to be clear. Another challenging aspect of 514 are some of the potentially time-consuming documentation and communication requirements. For example, it mentions listing and describing all of the points of use. Now, I don't know if that is supposed to be taken literally, but based on my conversation a month or so ago with somebody who's on the committee, I think they actually mean literally doing that. If it's a facility that is a small nursing home, Or maybe a big building like a data center that has a lot of room or space for equipment relative to the number of people, it may not have many outlets, 20 or 30, 40 even, which isn't that hard to list and to describe. But if it's a hospital with 1,000 outlets or more and remodeling going on almost continuously, which means some of those outlets are going to be changing, then it's a pretty big task to list all of those points of use. So what do you do about that? Well, one thing you can do is to make sure you're focusing on what protects health and life, regardless, in fact, of whether it's an ASHRAE 514 or not, or whether it's required by regulations. This is what you want to focus on. And what I mean by what protects health and life, basically the control measures. So if you think back to that list of essential elements that's in both of the standards, control measures are the only thing, maybe validation procedures to some extent, that affect the water, that affect the contaminants in the water. Does it affect the chemistry in the water? Does it affect the water temperature, the flow? Will it affect biofilm buildup? These are all things that will protect health and life, potentially. Those are the things that you need to focus on and put the rest of it in another column. So I don't mean literally to divide your water management program and plan into 2 columns, but just think of it that way. Like column A, what protects health and life, column B, everything else. And then all the other stuff, consider based on regulations, because of course you want to avoid fines and citations, right? Whether it's a Joint Commission standard or a state health department regulation, you want to do that. You want to avoid those fines. But otherwise, just think of it in terms of benefit versus cost. So flow diagrams, for example, take the same example, listing all the points of use. Maybe that's really going to help you implement the control measures. That's really the purpose of all of those other elements, those 7 elements, the flow diagrams, the documentation, the communication, even the hazard analysis. It's really to make sure that you're doing what you should do operationally and in terms of maintenance to reduce risk in the water. That's the purpose really of all those other things. I mean, some of them like documentation you might need to comply with a regulation to show somebody what you're doing. But in terms of reducing risk, that's their purpose. So if it does help you to list all the points of use, to do it, if it's going to help you implement your control measures. But otherwise, you can choose not to do it. And even if somebody's going to inspect, if it's going to hinder you from focusing on the measures that protect health and life, then you'll need to decide. I mean, if it were me, I would rather keep somebody from getting sick. I'd pay a fine rather than making somebody sick. It's like other things, right? If you fill the jar with the small rocks first, you don't have room for the big rocks. So focus on the big rocks. Use the 80-20 rule. Don't spend 80% of your time, money, and energy on the things that don't really reduce risk. But on the other hand, don't be too quick to say you can't do it. You can't do some of the documentation and communication procedure along with the key control measures because you don't have enough money, you don't have enough personnel. I don't mean to be unempathetic with those of you who are really stretched, and I know it's a lot of you who are stretched in terms of your personnel, in terms of your budget. I know that's a real thing. But also there are ways to overcome at least part of that. And one way is to automate. Automate as much as you can. I mean, that's something we've done in LAMPS, really have emphasized and have worked really hard on and have more to do. But we've done a lot of that over the last 4 years just to make water management programs easier and easier and easier. And it's not just to save our customers time and money. It's because it actually results in better prevention. Again, because you can focus on the big rocks. So there are some question marks too. So thinking back to that slide, as far as what the regulations will be, which will be required to do, it depends on whether 514 really gets traction. And if so, how long does it take? Is it going to affect CMS, their Legionella mandate? Will that be expanded? It already mentions some other pathogens, but will they expand it to even include physical and chemical hazards? And I keep using that term physical and chemical hazards, but again, you'll want to come up with a specific explanation of those. Really, physical hazards is just scalding. I don't think there's anything else in the physical hazard category. The chemical hazards would involve a few different things. Will it affect state regulations? There are some state regulations now that are based on ASHRAE 188. Will those be expanded to include 514? Will new regulations be based on 514 rather than 188? Will Joint Commission expand standard EC 020502 to include 514 in addition to 188? What about insurance companies? Will they require it? That doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Insurance companies really want their customers, want their insureds to do good water management because they know it reduces the risk of illness. They know it reduces their risk of paying claims. But so far, they've done very little in terms of making it a requirement for general liability policies anyway. Maybe they do for environmental liability policies, which is too bad because they could really move the needle on prevention. And then what about foreign regulations? Most foreign regulations haven't really picked up ASHRAE 188. Maybe to some extent, the regulations in Vancouver, British Columbia, I don't recall whether it specifically mentions ASHRAE 188, but certainly I think 188 had something to do with how those were formed, kind of the spirit of those regulations. So will, in any case, foreign regulations be based on 514? So these are question marks still. And really a more important question is, will ASHRAE 514 improve public health? I don't think the answer to that question is any different than what it would be if we said, will ASHRAE 188 improve public health? Because the differences in terms of the impact on public health are going to be probably minuscule between the more broader, more detailed requirements in 514 versus 188. Probably is going to make almost zero difference. The real question is, will it increase the number of facilities that execute effective prevention? We know history tells us from ASHRAE 188, since it was finalized and introduced in June of 2015, that most facilities will do only what they have to do. Certainly, it has increased the number of facilities that have water management plans, no question about that, especially in hospitals, because they're required by CMS, and the ones that are accredited by Joint Commission, they need to have them. But overall, the percentage of facilities, let's say it's about 5 million buildings in the US, that would fall into the category of needing an ASHRAE 188 water management plan, the percentage of them that has a plan at all is pathetically low. And the percentage that is fully implementing a comprehensive plan is even less. We did a study in 2021 of more than 900 water management plans, ones that were comprehensive. They're in the LAMP software, so we know that at least they have the opportunity to be comprehensive. They can deactivate control measures if they want to. But we looked at a couple of key metrics, 3 or 4 actually key metrics, and we're really surprised, pretty shocked by how clear the findings were. And I ended up talking about this at the Association of Water Technologies convention in 2021. And it really boiled down to 2 things. One is a very low percentage of facilities were keeping up with their control measures, had control measure verification compliance greater than 80%. But as control measure verification compliance increased and as tests increased, like temperature and disinfectant tests, for the ones that were testing for Legionella, as all of that engagement increased, the Legionella positivity in domestic water decreased. And I mean, it was so clear, it was almost linear, that it made it really obvious. The premise of ASHRAE 188 is sound. If comprehensive water management plans are fully implemented, it really does reduce Legionella. But overall, the reason, very likely then, that the standard has had an unnoticeable effect on the incidence of Legionnaire's disease is because, again, so few facilities are actually implementing it. We don't want to get confused into thinking, oh, the answer is we need more details in the standard. We need to have more requirements, more guidance. No, we need more engagement. We need facilities to take responsibility and do that. And again, the number is increased, not only among hospitals, but there are some facilities that are doing it voluntarily, but these are the facilities that do everything else well. They treat their employees well. They maintain their buildings, not just their water systems. They maintain their buildings well. They have valuable brands that they want to protect and so forth. So they're the ones, the early adopters who do it. But that's the key question. So one of the factors as to how many facilities will adopt 514 or 188 for that matter is, will it be required? Again, we know history tells us, as much as we'd like to think there's going to be voluntary compliance, we know that hasn't happened. And the states know that too. That's why the CDC in recent years has been encouraging states to adopt regulations, and some states now have them. Other states, they have regulations proposed. So I'm not telling you, if you're with a health department, I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But the other thing, too, is in addition to the facilities having responsibility and needing to focus on the big rocks and not the small rocks, the regulatory requirements need to do that, too. It's not enough just to require plans. They need to be really smart regulations. And again, they need to be focused on the key preventive measures, on what is really going to reduce risk. I hate to hear of situations like this. Thankfully, I haven't heard it too much, but more than once, though, where a facility, I get feedback that a facility that was doing a really good job with their water management plan, keeping up with their control measures, comprehensive control measures, keeping up with them, doing tests for temperatures and disinfectants, maybe even other water quality parameters, got cited, and I won't name an organization, but got cited because their flow diagrams didn't list all the types of points of use. I mean, come on. We can talk about and we can debate what makes a good flow diagram. I would say simpler is better because you want to make sure the team can easily see where water's coming from and where it's flowing to. I've been to facilities, or at least one I can remember, where I asked them, where is this decorative fountain that was in a courtyard? Where does it get its water? And they didn't know. And that's sometimes not an easy question to answer. If they have multiple points of entry to a campus and an irrigation system, and they don't know if that decorative fountain is getting its water from a tee off the domestic line in Tower A versus Tower B, or is it a tee off of the irrigation system? But that's important to know. In this case, the facility had a list of the point of use types, and they were referred to in the flow diagram. They just weren't in the flow diagram, which, and again, in my opinion, it makes the flow diagram actually better to not have that clutter. But regardless of that, we don't have to agree on what flow diagrams should look like, but we can agree on this. A flow diagram is not going to affect the chemistry in the water. It's not going to affect the temperature. It's not going to affect the flow, and it's not going to affect the biofilm. Now, I think flow diagrams are super important, and they can help a facility implement their control measures, and especially to respond to emergency situations. Totally agree they're important. But it's more important to focus on those big rocks. So some of the big rocks we looked at in LAMPS, and we came up with a performance report. We also have an audit report. But the performance report looks at 10 key metrics, and they focus on control measure verification, whether that's up to date, control measure, whether they're up to date, like when we update something in the LAMPS default, not only control measures, but the confirmation section and some of the other sections. Has the facility updated their section since we updated the default? They don't have to accept what we do. We don't want to force them to do that. They can edit the text, but we at least want them to look at it, right? And to look at new control measures, and they can choose not to do them. They may not even apply to their facility, but they need to at least look at them. So we look at that. We look at the tests they've done, temperatures and disinfectant tests. And not only the number of tests, but are the readings, what percentage of the readings are within their targets? And so we score each of these 10 metrics and give them in a column, in the right column, some advice, like if you're not scoring well, here's what you can do to improve it. And then a final score based on all 10 metrics, a score that, perfect score is 100. They can even get extra credit for a couple of things. And I mean, if we can do it with the small team we have, health departments, other regulators, you can do it too. Come up with some really key metrics on which you evaluate these water management programs, so you're focusing on the big rocks. And then there's kind of a sweet spot to experts on regulations would say this. I'm not an expert on regulations, but a sweet spot where they're not too lax, because if you don't check enough, facilities won't do it. But if you make it too detailed, too prescriptive, then facilities go into survival mode, and they spend their money and their time and their energy on trying to survive inspections instead of on really managing the water. And it's counterproductive. It can actually surprisingly or ironically result in an increased risk. So what work is actually needed to convert water management plans from 188 to 514? And for those of you who have really good water management plans, you've been working hard at them, don't be discouraged by this, because by the additional requirements. And you shouldn't be discouraged if you do have a comprehensive plan. The good news is the additional work will be really minimal. You might have to do nothing more in terms of actual maintenance procedures, but you'll probably need to, you will need to rewrite some stuff, reword some stuff, like the scope we talked about to accommodate those additional hazards, adding validation procedures. So adding validation procedures to cover temperature, to make sure there's not scalding risk, or to validate the control of scalding risk, and validation procedures for chemical hazards aren't too difficult. If you try to add validation procedures specifically for pathogens in addition to Legionella, it gets a little tricky. I'm not saying not to do it, but just give it some real thought. There's a tremendous amount, as most of you probably know, there's a tremendous amount of information and guidance and scientific studies that pertain to responding to Legionella results. There's not agreement among everybody. Some people say, well, for domestic water, you should look just at positivity, the percentage of samples in which Legionella is found. Others say, look at concentrations, focus on that. In LAMPS, we look at both. We have analytics for both. So there may not be agreement among everyone, but there's a lot of information on which a team can make decisions, but not so much with mycobacteria or with Pseudomonas, and even less so with some other pathogens. So if you don't find in your country, if you don't have clear guidance or until there are enough scientific studies to really know how to respond to those, then you really need to respond to any positive result. So just be prepared to do that if you test for those other pathogens. You need to rewrite the risk hazard analysis so it is based on establishing control locations, based not just on Legionella, but on the other hazards. That's pretty easy to do. And if you don't already have them, you need to add control measures to cover those additional hazards. If your water management plan is in LAMPS, you won't have to do any of this stuff because we're doing the heavy lifting. We're going to write all this. I've already rewritten the scope. We're redoing some of the validation procedures. We already had the control measures for chemical hazards and for scalding. So there's nothing more to do there. We'll rewrite the reasoning for the hazard analysis. So all you'll do, you'll get an email from us, in a week, maybe 2 weeks, that will explain exactly how to do it. And it'll probably boil down to just looking at a couple of logs where you see red rows instead of green rows. You'll go to those red rows, that place in your plan, and look at the new text. You don't have to accept it. You can keep it the way it is. You can use part of what we add, but you can really just accept those changes and you'll be good to go. Should take less than an hour probably to do that updating. So just my opinion, but based on everything we've talked about, I think there's some great information and guidance in ASHRAE 514. And despite the challenges, I think it'd be good to follow it. Like I said, in LAMPS, we've already had control measures for years, long before there was even a first draft of 514 for chemical hazards and scalding. So I would suggest you follow at least the spirit of the standard, but set it up, do it in a way that sets you up for success and is easy enough, hopefully with a lot of automation, but easy enough to be sustainable. And then also that minimizes your legal risk. I'm not an attorney and can't give you legal advice, but in terms of how you describe your hazards, for example, I would run that by your attorney before you finalize it. Even the part that, like I mentioned, that we're doing in LAMPS that we're rewriting for you, don't just accept what we've done. Have your attorney take a look at that. We will wrap it up with that. I hope the webcast has been helpful to you. Thank you. God bless you. We'll see you next time.